A saint takes various forms, but we are most accustomed to the saints of mortal human form. A familiar face in the community, someone who acts out of kindness without expecting anything in return. But a person like this is also at risk of being taken for granted, often pushed over or going beyond their limitations physically and mentally. The people of Inviolata have their own saint, but he is barely acknowledged as anything more than some sort of slave. His name is Lazzaro. This film had me in a chokehold since I watched it back in 2018, and my brain refused to let it go. I think there were many reasons for that, one being that I had no idea what most of the messaging was, and another being that I thought this film was gorgeous and genuine. This will be my first foreign film that I talk about on this channel. It's Italian, so you'd think that those 7 years of Italian language class back in primary school would make me somewhat of an Italian expert. Well, prepare to be severely disappointed, because I can only remember greetings and words such as bambini and bambino. I'm aware that it's been 13 years since I've taken those classes, but I cannot help but feel a little disappointed in myself. So with that being said, I apologize in advance if I say something incorrectly or if I use the wrong terminology. I really don't want to upset anyone, especially Italians. So with all that being said, let's summarize the plot of Happy as Lazzaro. Inviolata is a small working village in the south of Italy that is host to the tobacco fields. This village is full of farmers who live in rough conditions, and you would think that they were all living in the dark ages when you get an intimate look into one of the homes, which only has one light bulb that is shared around the house when needed. The homes are so packed to the brim with people that there is hardly any room to walk around. About 26 people per house. The farm is run by the Marchese Alfonso della Luna, the owner of the tobacco fields, and she seems to be living in luxury with her moody teenage son Tancredi. But we quickly realize that the business is going into bankruptcy. Lazzaro is a fellow villager who is used by the people around him for various hard-working jobs. But he is happy to do so, and it never seems to bother him at all. He is usually in the background of every conversation and every affair, and he is often unacknowledged. An accountant named Nicola appears every so often with a priest to take stock of what has been farmed and also to give the people some goods that were asked for. The priest is there to hold a church service for the children. It is clear from this point that the farmers work for nothing quite a lot, hence why they are only paid in goods to live on. But due to bankruptcy, the demands are high, and it never seems to be enough. The farmers don't get paid any wages, and that has been the norm for quite some time. One day, the Marchese's son goes missing and he's run away from home, and she orders the villagers to search for him. Lazzaro has a chance meeting with the missing teen named Tancredi, a rich misfit who has had things handed to him on a silver platter all his life, and is definitely not accustomed to being in the dry landscape of Inviolata like Lazzaro is. So Tancredi orders Lazzaro to help him by hiding him away from everyone and bringing supplies to him every so often. But Tancredi gets bored a lot without his expenses, so he demands that Lazzaro gives him company a bunch. In order to keep Lazzaro from doing the good deed of returning him to his worried mother, Tancredi calls him a kidnapper, so Lazzaro is forced to be a partner in crime. This would be his first ever friendship. Tancredi knows that the farmers are being exploited by his mother, and he wants no part in it, and really wants to help, but he doesn't really know how. Meanwhile, Teresa, Nicola's wealthy daughter, is actually worried about Tancredi, but she is told not to call the authorities. One day, Lazzaro is overcome with a peculiar fever that doesn't get better. We are to assume that he's pushed himself too far. Tancredi notices Lazzaro's absence as he has nothing to eat. Desperate, he calls home pretending that he was urged by his kidnapper to give them money, but the phone call was picked up by a worried Teresa, who is rational enough to call the police. Lazzaro decides to walk out into the rocky landscape towards Tancredi, who is hiding in Lazzaro's makeshift home. Lazzaro is delirious and unbalanced, struggling to walk, until he sees the unfamiliar sight of a police helicopter. Lazzaro is watching from a cliff's edge, which dizzies him to the point of losing balance and falling to his death. The helicopter comes to the villagers, who are bewildered at the sight of something so unfamiliar. Police authorities exit the helicopter and go to investigate the village. They are shocked to see that villagers are living in such poor conditions and without pay. Children were seen as a lower priority and didn't go to school. The police drop a bombshell that the farmers were made to work on an undocumented tobacco farm by the Marchese, who obviously wanted a cheaper way to make her coin. These farmers were subject to sharecropping and were meant to be getting wages, and instead were being treated like slaves. Sharecropping has been outlawed decades ago. The Marchese brainwashed an entire community for all these years into thinking that this was a normal life to live. With that being said, the villagers were ushered to a few buses outside the village, not knowing what their lives would be like beyond it, but they missed one person: Lazzaro. Tancredi, on the other hand, was found and was transported out of the village too. His mother was going to prison for a heinous crime. We then come to Act 2. Lazzaro surprisingly awakens from his fall, and the fever has disappeared. He comes back to an empty village, no people and no furniture. He travels to the Marchese's estate, no one to be found, but the place is quite dusty and run down, like it's been there for decades. But he finds that he's not alone, as there are some questionable men going around the estate taking priceless items. When confronted by a confused Lazzaro, they tell him they're removalists. Lazzaro is prompted to ask where everyone has gone. They only say that everyone left. Lazzaro is now even more confused, but he doesn't have time to think about it anymore because he starts helping them out, unknowingly partaking in stealing. The men leave Lazzaro and drive off after telling him that the city is not far ahead and is walkable. It was not. Lazzaro begins his long walk and he comes across Nicola, who has aged a lot and is now confined to a mobility scooter. He's somewhat an auctioneer, giving jobs to poor people for the lowest price they can afford to work under. Lazzaro tries to speak to Nicola, but after Nicola recognizes him, he screams at Lazzaro to go away. Clearly affected by the major uncovering in Inviolata that he took part in all those years ago, Lazzaro walks further and comes across a robbery at a gas station. It's the same men from the estate that he met before. After a chaotic and quite pointless heist at the gas station, they arrive in the city with Lazzaro, where they live in the slums. The house is not really a house, and more of a shack, a hollowed out tank of some sort. A woman comes out to greet her husband and her son Pippo, who is part of the gang, but a state of shock overcomes her. As if she had seen a ghost, she recognizes Lazzaro and kneels before him. The woman turns out to be a fellow farmer from the village, Antonia, but despite being close in age, she looks decades older than Lazzaro. Things start falling into place. The remaining farmers from the village live here in the slums. All of them have aged. It's set in stone when they all read the newspaper clipping, which covered what was called the Great Swindle. The 54 farmers, including children, have worked under slavery on a tobacco field that was closed off in 1977. The De Lunas were keeping the farmers unknowingly in the dark and brainwashing generations of people for many years, until they were found out to be fraudulent in 1997. 20 years ago. Lazzaro is now basically some sort of immortal being. We realize that life didn't get much better for the poor villagers since their relocation to the city. They still live a poor lifestyle 20 years on, dwelling in the outskirts, living on minimal food. Nothing is mentioned whether any of the 54 farmers were compensated from the Great Swindle. Lazzaro is willing to help them out the same way he did for them 20 years ago, but he has one thing on his mind: what happened to Tancredi? After teaching his peers that they can grow food from common plants around them, Lazzaro soon found Tancredi in an empty nightclub. Upon first meeting, Tancredi is hardly recognizable to Lazzaro, but Tancredi definitely remembered him. Not long after the reunion, Tancredi takes him to the bank to try and get a loan for a power plant. Not long after that, Tancredi leaves the bank laughing and being called a joke by his business partner. Tancredi is actually a time waster who despises the big banks. Lazzaro takes Tancredi to visit Antonia and the farmers to have dinner. This is when he invites them to lunch at his place the next day. They are told to look presentable. So the next day, they are all dressed up in whatever they have, and even go to the extent of buying expensive pastries with what little they had, as a gesture for Tancredi hosting them for lunch. But upon arriving at his doorstep, they are met with another familiar face, Teresa, and she's not in good shape. She doesn't know of a lunch that's happening in Tancredi's home and asks him, but he sounds irritable, so Teresa rudely turns them away. The farmers are about to leave until Teresa calls them back, asking what they have in the package, which were the pastries. Teresa asks them if they could leave the pastries with her, as she and Tancredi are hungry and broke. The farmers are in an uproar, but Antonia silences them and gives Teresa the pastries, insinuating she needs it more than they do. On their way home, they hear music coming from a church, so they pile in to listen, but the nuns turn them away. Soon after the farmers leave, a gust of wind comes in and steals the music away from the church, so the organs only let out wind. The wind carries the music over to the farmers as they go home. Pippo asks Antonia why they can't just go back to Inviolata and live there on their own terms, growing food when they need it. They all talk about the possibility, whilst Lazzaro stays behind, staring into the void, upset for them, Tancredi, and the De Lunas. So he tries something daring. He goes to the bank the next day and asks the bank tellers to give the money back to everyone he knows, as they are all struggling. Everyone in the bank assumes that he has a gun, which they later find is a slingshot Tancredi made 20 years ago. In outrage, the customers kick him to the ground until he dies, for what is assumed to be the final time. A wolf watches him, and then leaves the bank, roaming the streets. The film ends. It is a story of exploitation and its long-lasting effects, but it goes a little deeper than that, using symbolism and pagan parables of religion. I think it only makes sense if we first talk about the village of Inviolata. So I've read somewhere that Inviolata means unspoiled and untouched. Inviolata is associated with land. So for example, in Italy there is a regional parkland called Parco Naturale Regionale Inviolata. So it's the Italian definition of a natural space untouched by humans and made just by nature. But let's move on. The fictional village of Inviolata is loosely based on a true event in Italy of tobacco farmland being undocumented and the farmers being unpaid and essentially used as slaves. A real piece of exploitation. The farmers were victims of sharecropping, and you are probably wondering what that is. It is referred to in Italy as mezzadria, in which it comes from the word mezzo, which means half. It's a farming contract between a landlord and a farmer. The landowner provides the land, goods, and accommodation, while the farmer provides their skilled hands and hard work, all the while committing to their own family. Harvests were equally divided between both landowner and the farmer. Landowners used it to sell, and farmers used it to live on. However, the farmers received no payment in money, and instead the payment would be some goods, all dependent on how much money is accumulated by the landowner selling the crops. The problem with this relationship is that it was hardly equal. Farmers were casual workers with a contract that was annually renewed, and these were farmers with little wealth. So farming was expected to be in every aspect of their life, and even when it comes to family. With families so big, that means there were more workers, but unfortunately they would usually be crammed into small houses. It has been a prevalent relationship since the 9th century, but it started reaching its decline when industrialization came onto the scene. The introduction to heavy machinery meant that hard labor wasn't really needed anymore, as it was more efficient. While sharecropping had some unofficial laws depending on where they took place, it was ultimately outlawed officially around 1945 for various reasons, two of them mainly being that they had machinery to do the job, and that sharecropping meant that farmers were not living in good conditions. You can read more about it from this journal article, which I will link below. In the film, it's the same case. 54 people ranging from 0 to 80 years of age live in a village in a crumbling condition, and work as tobacco farmers around the clock under the blistering hot sun of southern Italy, unpaid. This is a normal life for them, unfortunately, as they do not know any difference. No one is left Inviolata. The De Lunas fed them lies and told them that it's dangerous to leave. That's why it was so hard for the authorities to convince them that the ankle-deep water between the farmers and the evacuation buses was safe to cross. On top of that, the Marchese Afonso would teach the children, often using Catholic religion to basically brainwash them. Also, none of the villagers can read, which makes it easy for them to be led astray. Nicola, the accountant, often visits them to make sure everyone is somewhat comfortable and doing the usual. This is to ensure that they don't start a riot or go looking where they shouldn't. He maintains his influence over them by bringing them goods that they ask for, and makes out that he's treating them better than the Marchese. The farmers clearly don't like him any better. Many a time, half the goods that they ask for are being kept from them due to money problems concerning the tobacco industry. They are basically bankrupt and have been for quite some time, hence why no farmer gets paid. They get paid in the bare minimum of supplies to get by, keeping them in poverty. The Marchese Alfonso della Luna has one son, Tancredi, and her husband is, well, not really around. Tancredi would spend most of his time in the city with his father, which is the reason for his little tantrum when he is dumped with his mother for a while in Inviolata, a place that has no phone reception to his demise. Tancredi has obviously been influenced by his parents to think that smoking another cigarette will subside his cough, a cough that he got from the cigarettes. This looks like our first symbol of a cycle. Tancredi is knowledgeable of his family's wrongdoings and the exploitation of the farmers, and it never sits right with him. But he's just a kid who can't do much about it. Alfonso makes the remark, "Set them free, and they realize they are slaves locked in their own misery." And she was sadly right about that. After being set free from the hands of the De Lunas, the villagers still lived in poverty and exploit for the next 20 years, in a different place under a different ruler. The writer and director Alice Warrisher claimed that life used to move in a circular motion, a cycle, but in the present day, it's now linear. People today are the same as the people long before us, and it is life that changes. 20 years on, these farmers have lived in the city outskirts and find themselves penniless, still purely surviving. The government and the banks never provided help for them, nor compensation for the great swindle. Lazzaro is a single entity who glides through life with the intention of just working and offering a helping hand to the people of the village. For him, life is good and satisfactory. We also don't get much more background on him, as he is somewhat in the background of everyone's life, yet at the very center of this story. We see him as a bright light, whilst everyone around him barely pays him attention. Though he has good intentions, he is there to be exploited by everyone around him, whilst everyone around him is being exploited by someone else. The Marchese says it herself. It's a chain reaction that can't be stopped. Tancredi makes us question this statement by using Lazzaro as an example of someone who doesn't intend to take advantage of anyone. Lazzaro may be the one that intervenes with the cycle. We spend the rest of the film trying to figure out if it can be stopped by this one boy. Warrisher gives us some insight on what Lazzaro's position holds in the story, and she explains that he is the embodiment of the humanity that every human being holds. He doesn't know good from evil, but goes through life assuming that everything is inherently good. She goes on to say that people would call individuals like that stupid, a childlike way to live your life, which is safe to say why the villagers around him treat him like a fool. They don't take him seriously, and he only exists to them as their own person to order around. And he does what he's told, unknowingly being exploited. Again, he doesn't know good from evil. This is why he is seen as a saint, as he holds no judgment towards anything and anyone. Everything is inherently good. His apparent death in the first half seemed as though it was the result of being taken for granted so much. Even though he had a fever, he was still expected to be there for everyone. When Tancredi asked Lazzaro 20 years later why he wasn't around, Lazzaro felt guilt for having the said fever, which rendered him unable to help anyone. All he knows is exploitation. It's safe to say that he made everyone's lives better by just being there, offering help. In the second act, Lazzaro shows the farmers that there is plenty of food around them. He finds potatoes, carrots, and other edible plants growing in the small patches of nature, trying their best to break through the concrete jungle. So I had to think really hard on this part. Throughout the film, wind and wolves are prevalent and are key contributors to the meanings in this story. So let's start with the wind. In a few moments of the film, the villagers make a whooshing wind sound in unison, which is usually in response to something that threatens them or something they don't like. It's used for intimidation and sometimes a looming warning. In most literature, the wind is known to carry things, and it actually does in reality, as it can carry sounds, temperatures, and anything it can manage to pick up. But people also believe that the wind can bring about things like happiness, misfortune, and change. Change of good fortune is what I believe the winds were carrying to the farmers of Inviolata. There's a good example of this when the helicopter flies to Inviolata and ultimately saves them from years of slavery. You can hear the same whooshing sound of the wind whilst the helicopter is in the sky, and you get the impression that it's being carried to the village. The helicopter is the first indicator of change that is about to befall upon the farmers. Another example plays out in the ending of the film, when the farmers were turned away from the church when all they wanted to do was listen to music. The wind rushed in and stole the music from the church organ, leaving them with nothing but air. The wind ended up carrying the music to the farmers as good fortune. And now we have the wolves. Like the wind, the looming sounds of wolves howling in the distance hangs around the characters, and more specifically, the village of Inviolata. Wolves have been a constant threat throughout, taking livestock from the farmers. What we come to realize is that they are not the only creatures that take from them. It's the Lunas too. The wolves are a metaphor for describing greed, and it's clear to us that the Lunas are the frightening wolves that keep the people of Inviolata in their place, trapped behind the wire fence of a chicken coop. There is something I realized upon finishing the film, and that is that the story was essentially already told in Act 1. Antonia tells the children a story of a saint and an old wolf, and it goes as follows. An old and decrepit wolf decides that he can no longer hunt, and is therefore excluded from the pack. He gets really hungry, and would feed himself by stealing livestock from the villagers. And since they struggled to defeat him, they would be forced to stay up and guard the livestock every night. Traps were set, but they could never catch him. It's as if he were invisible. The villagers, with no options left, called upon a saint to find the wolf and stop him for good. So the saint travelled far and wide for so long, but he couldn't find the wolf. Until one day, he finally found him, and he saw that the wolf was just hungry, just doing what he can to survive. The wolves are actually the people caught in the cycle of exploitation. Once the Lunas' empire had crumbled, they starved. Tancredi had no means of feeding himself, as the farmers realized upon going to his home in the second act. The banks sucked his family dry. The Lunas have been bankrupt from the very beginning of the film, and did what they could to keep their heads above water. The exploitation inflicted onto the farmers was soon inflicted on Lazzaro, as they were hungry too. Lazzaro is that very saint who found that the wolf was just like everyone else, caught in a cycle of exploitation. While we obviously don't condone from taking things from the person below you, exploitation has basically become a part of our lives in the present day. From Act 1, we've been left to make our own conclusion on whether the cycle of exploitation can be broken, but instead, the film ends on uncertainty. The saint's journey began with the intention of stopping such a force, but all he finds is the cause, and not the answer everyone wanted. All we know is that we are all hungry, and all that we know is to take and be exploited by people higher up in the chain.